Before I begin my tribute and review video for the rock band Genesis, I have a special message to any rock music troll or Genesis purist fan out there who may be offended that I happen to like the Phil Collins era of Genesis. Let me remind you of something. There is no law that says you cannot like certain rock bands. There is no law that says you cannot like certain albums by certain rock bands. And in the case of Genesis, there is no law that says you cannot like the Phil Collins era of Genesis. Everybody is entitled to their personal music tastes, including me. So, if it actually offends you that I happen to like the Phil Collins era of Genesis, then do us both a favor and turn off this video right now and go watch something else. I wouldn't want you to waste your time. Thanks. Hello everybody, this is Alan, and today I'm going to be starting a brand new music series on my YouTube channel. I love music. I'm one of the world's biggest music fans. I consider myself a musicologist. I couldn't live without music. Music has always been my lifeline all throughout my life. I treasure my music collection as if they were my children. You know, that's how much I love music. And today on my YouTube channel, I'm going to start a brand new music series where I show my love, I show my appreciation for as many music artists, bands and solo artists as I possibly can, whose music means so much to me personally. And the first band that I'm going to kick off with is my all-time favorite band in the world, and that band is Genesis. I first discovered Genesis in 1981 with the release of the Abacab album. I was only 12 years old when that album came out, but I remember when Abacab came out and FM radio stations in my area started playing stuff from it, like, say, the title track, it just blew me away. I had never heard anything like it before. I was immediately taken by, say, the title track to Abacab. I had never heard drumming like that before. The lead singer's voice was amazing. I'd never heard a lead singer sing like that before. I was amazed by the keyboard work on the track, and I was also amazed by the guitar playing on it. And I was very, very intrigued. And of course, they started playing some other tracks from the album, like No Reply at All and Keep It Dark and Man on the Corner. And, I said, this band is great. I gotta buy the album. So I went down to my nearby record store and bought myself my very first cassette copy, because we had cassettes back then. This was before CDs. I bought a cassette copy of Abacab. It was the first Genesis album I ever bought, and I fell in love with the album, and from that moment on, I was a Genesis fan for life. I had found my band. As time went on, I went back for the previous albums, including the stuff that guitarist Steve Hackett was on, and of course the stuff that Peter Gabriel sang lead vocals on, to go along with the wonderful work of Phil Collins on lead vocals and drums, Tony Banks on keyboards, and Mike Rutherford on guitars and basses, as well as the early stuff with original guitarist Anthony Phillips, and as well as the previous drummers who sat at the drum kit before Phil, of course being Chris Stewart, John Silver, and John Mayhew. And of course, let's not forget that last studio album that Genesis did in 1997, Calling All Stations, with their last lead singer, Ray Wilson, who sang lead vocals on that final album. I'm a quintessential diehard Genesis fan. I love all of the band's music, and I do understand the various changes that Genesis had to make over the years, as, soon, after Anthony Phillips left, and then Peter Gabriel left, and then Steve Hackett left. There's brilliant music on every single album Genesis have done. They are a band that have evolved, they moved along with the times, and, they survived the departures of Anthony Phillips and Peter Gabriel and Steve Hackett. They even did an album without Phil Collins at the end, but they've constantly moving with the times. I hear brilliant music on every single album that Genesis have ever made. And you know what? Even on the later albums, there's still some progressive rock. Yes, there is. There's progressive rock music on Invisible Touch. There's progressive rock music on Abacab. There's progressive rock music on, and then there were Three and Duke, the self-titled Genesis album, and there's some progressive rock on that final studio album, Calling All Stations. Genesis never ever abandoned their progressive rock roots, not even on the later stuff. It's there, and I'll point it out to you as we go through the albums. And now, let's go through the 15 studio albums that Genesis have recorded, and I'll give you my personal ranking of the band's 15 studio albums from my least favorite to my #1 favorite. So here we are. These are the studio albums of Genesis, and this is how I rank them. We're waiting for you. From Genesis to Revelation, the debut Genesis album from 1969. From Genesis to Revelation, the debut Genesis album, it's my least favorite of all the Genesis albums, but you know what? It's still a good album. The band were only teenagers at the time they recorded it. They were basically under the, shall we say, under the Svengali-ship of their producer Jonathan King, who was also the man who gave the band their name. And basically, there's a lot of pop songs and rock songs in there, but basically Jonathan King made the unfortunate decision to swamp a lot of the band's songs with a string section and with horns, and it's not quite as powerful as it could be, and it's certainly not the album that the band really truly wanted to make. But again, they were only teenagers at the time, and Jonathan King was controlling everything. Also, the mix of the album isn't quite good. There are some tracks where, you know, all the music's coming down one speaker and Peter Gabriel's lone voice is coming down another speaker, so the mix of the album isn't quite good either. But you know what? There's still some good songs here. I mean, not all the songs on the album are swamped in horns and strings, and that's basically the songs from the album that I like the most. I mean, you've got great rockers like In the Beginning, The Serpent, let's see, I also like The Conqueror, even though there's some strings on that one, but that's okay. So it's got some good songs there, and you know, the band had to start somewhere. And it's still a good album. It's the album that took me the longest to appreciate. It took me like 4 or 5 listens of it, I think, to fully appreciate it. But once I did, I finally realized that it is indeed a good album. And hey, for their first album out of the gate, I think From Genesis to Revelation is a very good Genesis album. Not the best thing they've ever done, definitely not. But hey, they had to start somewhere. And yeah, it's a good debut album for Genesis, From Genesis to Revelation. Calling All Stations from 1997. This was the final studio album from Genesis, with a young Scottish lad named Ray Wilson taking over the lead singer position from Phil Collins, and also taking over the drumming position from Phil Collins were a pair of drummers named Nir Zidkiyahu, also known as Nir Z, and Nick DiVirgilio. And Genesis, well, you know, Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford, they were very, very brave in trying to carry on Genesis without Phil Collins. But unfortunately, the album just did not do well at all here in the States. I think too many people in America still mistakenly think of Genesis as the Phil Collins band, which is totally wrong, but I think that's the general impression that a lot of people in America have of the group. And so trying to sell a Genesis without Phil Collins just didn't work. Even though if people had done their homework, they'd realize that Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford are original members of Genesis. Phil Collins is not. Phil joined on the 3rd album. He wasn't there from the very beginning, but it didn't seem to matter to record buyers, and they just didn't buy the album. As for the album itself, you know, Calling All Stations, I think it's a very good Genesis album. I think I appreciate the fact that it's darker. I appreciate that it's more progressive sounding. I do like Ray Wilson's singing on it. I think he has a very gravelly, Peter Gabriel-ish tone to his singing voice, and I'm sure that's why Tony and Mike chose him. And I thought he did a really good job singing. And as for the drumming, you know, obviously Nir Z and Nick DiVirgilio don't quite drum with the same flair that Phil Collins did, but their drumming is still good. It still sounds like Genesis to me. Tony Banks' keyboard playing on it is solid. Mike Rutherford's guitar playing on it is solid. And their songwriting on the album is solid. There's some really great Genesis music here. I mean, the title song, Calling All Stations, Congo, Alien Afternoon is a great prog rocker. There Must Be Some Other Way, which I think is the best song on the album. Very, very progressive sounding song. That's a terrific song. And of course, the final song on the album, which was the final song for Genesis, One Man's Fool, which is a terrific Genesis prog rocker. So Calling All Stations, I think, is a really good Genesis album. It's a damn shame that Tony and Mike didn't do any more after this, but, you know, the sales of the album were pretty poor. And I think Tony and Mike saw the writing on the wall that they just didn't think that they'd be able to sell any more records with Ray Wilson as the front man, even though he did a really good job on the album. So they basically pulled the plug on Genesis for 10 years until the reunion tour from 2007. But, you know, as I say, I think Tony and Mike should be commended for trying to carry on Genesis without Phil. And I think in the end, all things considered, even though it didn't sell squat, Calling All Stations is still a very good, very solid Genesis album. Invisible Touch. What needs to be said about Invisible Touch? This is the biggest selling album of the band's career. Invisible Touch, you know, I think it's a great album, but you know what? I am kind of disappointed that it's the album that Genesis are forever judged by. I mean, for a lot of people, Invisible Touch is the only Genesis album, and that's just not true. There is so much more to Genesis than just this one album. But nonetheless, Invisible Touch has got some great stuff on it. I mean, the title song, while I don't think the title song is the greatest thing the band have ever done, I am very pleased that it was a big hit for the band. Their only #1 single in the States. And it's a catchy tune. It's a catchy pop tune. It is what it is. It's a nice way to kick off the album. Tonight, Tonight, Tonight is a progressive rocker, the full-length version of Tonight, 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 rather than the shortened single version. But the full-length version, I think, totally qualifies as prog, and it's a kick-ass song, Tonight, Tonight, Tonight. It's arguably my favorite song on the album. You've got hit singles like Land of Confusion, great rocker there. In Too Deep is a beautiful ballad. Domino, that's a progressive rock song, and I just love the whole adventure of the track, and it's definitely prog rock. It's prog rock with a 80s polish, but it's still prog, and it's another piece that kicks ass on the record, and it's more evidence that Genesis did not abandon their prog rock roots on their later stuff. Domino is definitely prog. Great stuff. People only think of the hit singles from Invisible Touch, and they're great hit singles. Hey, I like pop. I like, pop rock. I like catchy songs, and you definitely have some catchy songs here on Invisible Touch. But Genesis did not abandon their progressive rock roots on this album. There's definitely some progressive rock stuff to be found on the longer tracks, as well as the instrumental, The Brazilians. So Invisible Touch, it's an excellent Genesis album, and I remain pleased to this day that it sold so well for the band and became their biggest selling album ever. But there is so much more to Genesis than just Invisible Touch. But it's a great album. We Can't Dance from 1991, and this was the final Genesis album with Phil Collins. We Can't Dance, I think it's a great album. I think it's definitely an improvement over Invisible Touch, as much as I like Invisible Touch, but I think We Can't Dance has music on it that's a little more powerful, the bands sound tighter. I just think the material is a little bit better on We Can't Dance. I know the album has been criticized as being too long, as being, overstuffed. But you know what? I applauded Genesis wholeheartedly for making the album as long as they did, and for giving us as many wonderful songs on this album as they did. I mean, again, I think the material is great, and the band sound terrific on it, and it's a very solid, powerful Genesis album. I love all the hit singles from it: No Son of Mine, I Can't Dance, Hold on My Heart. Great stuff. As a matter of fact, when I heard I Can't Dance, the moment I heard I Can't Dance, I said to myself, you know what, they got to release this as a single. They got to release this kick-ass rocker as a single, and sure enough, they did, and it wound up being the biggest hit from the album. It went top 10, I think number 7, I think it was, in America. Great song, I Can't Dance. There is still some progressive rock stuff on this album. Basically, Driving the Last Spike has some progression to it. Dreaming While You Sleep has some progression to it. And, of course, Fading Lights, the final song, that has some progression to it. So, again, I'm sticking to my guns on this, folks. Genesis never, ever abandoned their prog roots on their later stuff. There's definitely some progressive rock to be found on all of their albums. And We Can't Dance still has its share of progression in it, as well as pop hits. So again, I know the album has been criticized as being overstuffed, and maybe they could have lost a couple of songs, I suppose. Maybe Living Forever could have been left off the album. Maybe Never a Time could have been left off the album, even though they're both great songs. I like them. It's not that they're bad songs, but, you know, if you had to take a couple of songs off the album, maybe those would be the two songs to remove. But as it is, you know, I got no complaints about We Can't Dance. I think it's a great album. I think it was definitely an improvement over Invisible Touch, as much as I like Invisible Touch. But I do think that this album is a little bit better. So We Can't Dance, I think it's a great Genesis album and a great farewell to Phil Collins. Duke from 1980. This was definitely another transition for Genesis. The 70s were now officially over. Genesis were now getting into the 80s, and they decided to streamline their sound a little bit more, not lean as heavily on the progressive rock stuff, but there's still some progression on this album. Yes, there is. But basically make something that was a little more radio friendly, a little more accessible sounding. I mean, like I said, folks, it was 1980, and, you know, the band was down to Phil, Mike, and Tony. Peter Gabriel had left, Steve Hackett had left, and, you know, the band had to do something different. And if a few fans in the audience got pissed off, well, that's kind of too bad, but Genesis really needed to do something different. And I think Duke was definitely the first musical statement from the band to show that, hey, we're moving the band in a different direction now. But they still have some progressive rock on this album, okay? Duchess totally sounds progressive to me. Beautiful song, Duchess. That's one of my all-time favorite songs. And the conclusion, Duke's Travels and Duke's End, that has a very progressive sound to it as well. A very elongated instrumental piece. Great adventurous piece, that is, Duke's Travels and Duke's End. As well as the pop hits. I mean, of course, everybody knows Behind the Lines and Turn It On Again. Misunderstanding, of course, that was the big hit single from the album. And Duke, again, it's a great, solid Genesis album, and definitely a shaping of things to come for Genesis. Moving into the top 10, we have Genesis from 1983. It's also known as the Mama album, or Shapes, or whatever, but the official title is simply Genesis. And this was the album that signaled commercial breakthrough for the band, certainly in the United States, where they had their first top 10 hit single, That's All. This is a great album. This is a fabulous album. I just love the whole feel to this album, and of course, Mama. Big progressive sounding song, that is. A very sinister sounding tune, Mama is, and definitely sets the mood for the album really, really well. Home by the Sea, Second Home by the Sea, that's another example of progressive rock on this particular album. So again, Genesis have not abandoned their progressive rock roots on their later records. It's still there. But amongst that, you've got the hits like That's All. That was really the hit from the album. Also featuring on this album is a song that has been heavily criticized by fans and some music critics, which is Illegal Alien. You know, folks, I don't have a problem whatsoever with Illegal Alien, and I think it's ridiculous how other people seem to have a problem with it. It's a humorous kind of a tune, you know, it's not a song to take seriously. The band were obviously trying to be humorous on this song. And on top of that, I think Illegal Alien is a very catchy tune. I really, truly don't have a problem with Illegal Alien. I'm sorry if you do, but I don't. I like the humorous vocal that Phil does on it, and I think the band sound really good on it. So I like Illegal Alien. I don't have a problem with it. Other great songs like Just a Job to Do, which was actually the theme song for an old ABC cop show called The Insiders. Back from the 1980s. Do any of you remember that cop show? It didn't last very long, but yeah, Just a Job to Do was the theme tune for that ABC show. And of course, a brilliant closing song, It's Gonna Get Better. Wonderful, wonderful, beautiful song. Very, very uplifting. So, Genesis, or the Mama album, or Shapes, but the official title is just Genesis. Great album. From a dense forest of tall, dark pine woods. Nursery Crime from 1971. This is a landmark Genesis album in many ways. I guess the biggest landmark being that this is the first album with drummer Phil Collins and guitarist Steve Hackett coming on board. Anthony Phillips departed, and so did the previous drummer John Mayhew. So this is the first Genesis album with the five-man classic lineup of Gabriel, Rutherford, Banks, Collins, and Hackett. And it's a great album. It's classic Genesis. It's classic progressive rock. You've got all-time Genesis classics on this one, like The Musical Box, The Return of the Giant Hogweed, and The Fountain of Salmacis. Brilliant prog rock. I think this is also the first Genesis album that Tony Banks plays Mellotron on. He brought the Mellotron into the group for the first time. And brilliant stuff. The band's playing on it is magnificent. And there's also moments of humor on the album. I guess the big one being the song Harold the Barrel, which is about a song about a guy who wants to jump off a window ledge. but the band do it with humor. It's a very amusing song. Also, there's moments of great beauty on this album, like with Seven Stones. And it's also the album that features the debut lead vocal of Phil Collins. Even though Peter Gabriel is still the main singer at this point in time, Phil was allowed his debut lead vocal on the song For Absent Friends, a very lovely little tune. And yeah, it's a brilliant album. It's a Genesis classic, and I love that album cover with the women with the croquet mallets and the severed heads on the lawn. That's great. So yes, Nursery Crime, definitely a landmark Genesis album. It's definitely a classic and a brilliant, brilliant slice of progressive rock from Genesis. Coming in at number 8 in my personal Genesis album countdown is Abacab from 1981. Yes, that's right, we're fast-forwarding from 1971's Nursery Crime, fast-forwarding 10 years to 1981, and now it's Abacab, down to the trio of Phil, Mike, and Tony. And as I've mentioned earlier, this is the first Genesis album that I ever bought, so Abacab has a lot of great nostalgic value for me. I think it's a great kick-ass album, you know. It gets picked on by a lot of progressive rock snobs. You have to understand, it was 1981, the beginning of the 80s, and MTV had just started, and they wanted to do a really great rock album. They really wanted to amp up the rock on this one, and that means they had to streamline their sound. They couldn't do Selling England by the Pound Part 2 or Lamb Lies Down on Broadway Part 2. They had to do something different, you know? Different times, and the band was down to the trio now, and they wanted to make a solid rock album, and in my opinion, that's what they did, and I think this album kicks ass. It's great. I mean, the title song alone, I think, was the first proper Genesis song that really, really grabbed my attention, and it's a magnificent rocker with Phil, Mike, and Tony rocking out with everything they got. It goes into this really cool progressive instrumental jam towards the end. So I do think that it is indeed, in the end, a progressive sounding Genesis song, the full-length version of the title song to Abacab. Also, there's progressive rock to be found in the extended piece called Dodo Lurker, which again is lengthy, and Phil, Mike, and Tony really work it to the max, and it's brilliant stuff, and to me that's got some shades of progressive rock. The rest of the album is more radio-friendly, straightforward rock. But, you know, that's fine. That's fine. As far as I'm concerned, it's still Genesis. I hear great power in even, you know, the other hit tunes like No Reply at All. You know, okay, so they use the horn section from Earth, Wind, and Fire on that track, but so what? It works. Me and Sarah Jane, brilliant song from Tony Banks. That's one of Tony's best songs. Keep It Dark is a great little rocker. However, yes, I have to make mention of the infamous track from this album, the infamous track known as Whodunit, which many Genesis fans love to hate because it's a very repetitive kind of tune. The majority of Genesis fans don't seem to understand that Phil, Mike, and Tony were trying to be humorous on the track Whodunit. It's meant to be a humorous song, better known as a novelty song. But I don't know what it is, but when a band tries to be funny on a song, nobody seems to get the joke. It's like, what? Can bands not be humorous in their songs? I mean, really, I don't get it. But it all comes down to the repetitive lyrics of the song. You know, was it you or was it me? Was it he or she? Was it A or was it B? Or was it X or Z? Repeat. Was it you or was it me? Was it he or she? Blah, blah, blah. For me, I don't have a problem with the song. I think it's funny. I think it's humorous. I really like Phil's humorous Cockney voice on the song, and I think him and Mike and Tony are bashing on their instruments with everything they got, and musically it's fine. It's been referred to by the band as their punk song, the Genesis punk song, Who Done It, and yeah, okay, that's fine. That's a good description of it. Okay, you don't like Who Done It, fine, but I personally don't have a problem with Who Done It. I like Who Done It just fine, and I like it for what it is, a novelty song by Genesis. And I think the whole Abacab album kicks ass. And then there were three from 1978. This is the first Genesis album that the band recorded as a trio. Steve Hackett had just left the band, and so Mike Rutherford took over all the guitar parts on the Genesis albums from this point onwards. So the band are now a trio, hence the title, and then there were three. This is my favorite Genesis album that the band recorded as a trio. I love this album. I adore this album. I think Genesis really do give you the best of both worlds on And Then There Were Three, the progressive side and the mainstream rock side as well. It's like a blending of the two on this album. There's more songs, 11 Genesis songs, and it's great stuff. I mean, Down and Out, great rocker. I still don't know how Phil manages to play that pattern on Down and Out. I don't know how he does it, but it's a great Genesis prog rocker. Undertow's a beautiful song. Ballad of Big is a great story about a guy out in the Old West. Snowbound, beautiful song. Burning Rope is a great rocker. Deep in the Motherlode is an entrancing rocker. The Lady Lies, which Tony wrote, one of my all-time favorite Genesis songs. It is magnificent. It's just a great rocker. I love the way it moves. I love that instrumental bridge. I love how it ends with the band just totally kicking butt at the end, how it fades out with Tony like thumping on that piano with everything he's got, Phil bashing on his drum kit with everything he's got, Mike rocking out on those guitars. Brilliant song. And of course, Follow You, Follow Me, which concludes the album, which is a beautiful pop ballad and the band's first hit single. And of course, I absolutely love the cover. I look at this album cover and I think, this is beautiful. Beautiful picture there. Beautiful album cover, beautiful album. It's my favorite Genesis album that the band recorded as a trio. And then there were three. Tell me my life is about to begin. Tell me that I'm a hero. Coming in at number 6 is Trespass, the second Genesis album. This is from 1970. You've got Peter Gabriel, Mike Rutherford, Tony Banks, along with original guitarist Anthony Phillips in his second and final album with the group, as well as drummer John Mayhew in his only album with the group. I love Trespass. For me, this is the album where Genesis really shifted gears and became a full-fledged band. Because, from Genesis to Revelation, they were pretty much at the mercy of their Svengali producer, Jonathan King, who then swamped their albums with horns and a string section and blah, blah, blah. So they let Jonathan King go. They changed record labels, and they really went into high gear as a band for the first time. I mean, this really is, I think, the first Genesis masterpiece, and they really came up with an album that's really, truly something special. Even though Phil Collins and Steve Hackett still were not yet in the band, but Anthony Phillips is a phenomenal guitar player in his own right, and even though he only did the first 2 albums with the band, his place in Genesis history is more than secure. I mean, he definitely laid down the blueprint for Steve Hackett to follow. And, John Mayhew, let's give John Mayhew some credit where credit is due here. Is he Phil Collins? No. But he doesn't have to be Phil Collins. His drumming on this album is great. I don't think Peter and Mike and Tony would have chosen John Mayhew to play drums on the album if he wasn't a good drummer. His drumming on Trespass is really good. This is a marvelous album. Many brilliant Genesis classics are on this one. For me, the big one, of course, is The Knife, the all-time Genesis super rocker, super prog rocker, that one is. I've always said to myself, I would love to see Metallica do a cover of The Knife. I mean, this is probably like the closest Genesis ever got to metal music with The Knife. It's a fantastic rocker. The opening song, Looking for Someone, excellent. White Mountain is beautiful. Visions of Angels is a lovely piano tune. Stagnation, all-time Genesis classic. I just love the whole ebb and flow of Stagnation. And of course, Dusk. Dusk doesn't get too much of a mention, but it's a beautiful, beautiful song. Absolutely gorgeous. It's definitely one of my favorite Genesis ballads. Not a love song, but I mean, it's a very quiet kind of tune, but it's very lovely. I mean, it's just a very atmospheric song that just takes me away. And of course, you know, the final song is The Knife. And I love the album cover. I mean, you've got this pretty painting here, but then you see this knife slash going across the cover, and of course it continues on into the back cover, the knife there. This is a Genesis classic, and like I said, this is the first bona fide Genesis classic that the band came up with in 1970. They were on their way. With the release of Trespass, Genesis were totally on their way, and it's a phenomenal Genesis album, Trespass. I love it. Number 5, we have Selling England by the Pound, and this is, again, an all-time Genesis classic. The classic lineup of the band, totally secure now. It's a beautiful album. It really is an exquisite progressive rock album. It really is. I mean, some of the best stuff Genesis have ever done is on Selling England. I mean, no question about it. Dancing with the Moonlit Night, classic. I mean, just opening with Peter singing all by himself. Can you tell me where my country lies? And then the band slowly come in, and the song just builds and builds and builds into a great rocker. And then it has this gorgeous finale where it goes back into calm, and it's really, really lovely stuff. I Know What I Like. That was the band's first hit single, or at least their first hit single over in Britain. Catchy tune, the closest the Peter Gabriel version of Genesis ever got to a hit song. Classic stuff about the guy mowing his lawn. Firth the Fifth, all-time classic, with probably Steve Hackett's most famous guitar solo that he ever recorded with Genesis, right there on Firth the Fifth, classic. More Fool Me, which is the second vocal that Phil Collins did for the band. It's a beautiful acoustic number. I love it a lot. Battle of Epping Forest, epic tune, Battle of Epping Forest, and with lyrics that just don't stop. I mean, I don't know how Peter Gabriel manages to sing it. It's so very, very wordy, but it's a great adventurous tune. I love Battle of Epping Forest. After the Ordeal, beautiful instrumental tune. I think that was mostly penned by Steve Hackett. The Cinema Show, of course, another Genesis classic. Again, a very adventurous, beautiful song. It has its melodic stuff. It's got the rock stuff going on. The band paint very beautiful pictures, I think, on that song, the Cinema Show. I mean, just the whole imagery of the song is very lovely. And of course, Isle of Plenty, that's the conclusion of Cinema Show. And again, it's a wonderful conclusion to the album, and how the band send the album off into the sunset with Isle of Plenty. Selling England by the Pound, all-time classic Genesis album. I think it's Steve Hackett's personal favorite of all the albums that he did with the band. I think he names this one as his favorite. Beautiful Genesis album, all-time classic, and it's number 5 on my chart, Selling England by the Pound. At number 4, we have A Trick of the Tail from 1976. This is the first album that the band did without Peter Gabriel. The first one with Phil Collins taking over the lead singer position. And again, all-time Genesis classic. This is a phenomenal Genesis album. So many Genesis classics are on this one. Dance on a Volcano is a classic rocker. Entangled is gorgeous. Squonk. That's basically the Genesis version of Led Zeppelin's Kashmir. They were very, very inspired by Zeppelin's Kashmir and wanted to come up with something that had that kick-ass, steady drum beat to it. You know, I mean, Zeppelin had that dun-dun-dun, 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 and then Genesis have dun 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 dun. But anyway, Squonk, classic rocker. I think that's what I'm trying to say. Madman Moon is gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous Genesis song. Robbery, Assault, and Battery, great rocker. A Funny Tale About a Robber, great rockin' tune. Ripples is gorgeous. Ripples, one of my all-time favorite Genesis songs. One of the most beautiful songs the band have ever recorded. Trick of the Tail is a fun little tune about a very mischievous character. It's a wonderful storytelling song, very bouncy, upbeat kind of tune. And of course, Los Endos, that kick-ass instrumental, which basically sums up the whole album that came before it. And the band are just totally rocking out with everything they got. And there's even a little farewell to Peter Gabriel at the end of Los Endos. As the song's fading out, you can hear Phil singing, "There's an angel standing in the sun, free to get back home," which is a a couple of lines from Supper's Ready. This was basically the band's way of saying goodbye to Peter Gabriel with that closing bit of Los Endos. That was definitely a tip of the hat to Peter. Genesis definitely had a lot to prove when they did A Trick of the Tail, because, I mean, since too many people were labeling the group at the time as like the Peter Gabriel band. So could the band possibly survive without Peter? Of course they could. And this album right here is the proof of that. Trick of the Tail, all-time Genesis classic. And yes, the band could survive without Peter and move on, with all due love and respect to Peter. But yeah, Genesis, they weren't going to let the departure of a band member stop them from going on. And Trick of the Tail, definitely a Genesis masterpiece. And the Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, my number 3 favorite Genesis album of all time. Well, a lot has been said about this album over the years, and everybody has different opinions about The Lamb. Me, it's brilliant. It's a Genesis classic. It's a Genesis masterpiece. It's the only concept album the band ever made. It's the only double album they ever made. And of course, it's the final album with Peter Gabriel. That's important to say. Everybody has different versions of what the story is about, although we all pretty much agree that it's about a Puerto Rican kid named Rael and his adventures in New York City, or at least his story begins in New York City. One particular interpretation of this album that stuck out for me is one that I read, that it could be a story about Rael fighting to save his soul in the afterlife. At the beginning of the album, when he gets hit by a car or hit by a bus on the song Fly on a Windshield, that could be the part where he gets killed. And for the rest of the album, Rael is trying to save his soul. He's trying to redeem himself. I mean, basically, he's a punk. He's committed crimes. Not the most squeaky clean of fellows. And so from Broadway Melody of 1974 onwards, or at least from the next song, Cuckoo Cocoon, onwards, basically Rael's adventures in a very funky, afterlife, kind of purgatory, I guess you like. It's neither heaven nor is it hell. It's like a purgatory kind of thing, and basically he's fighting to save his soul. And by the time we get to the end of the album, because he also is trying to save his brother John, I guess you could say John is a symbolic figure to Rael. By the end of the album, Rael saves his brother John, and in my opinion, by saving John, Rael has saved himself, and he has saved his soul. And I think, even though many people would say that The Lamb doesn't seem to have a definitive ending to it, I think the ending is that Rael moves on to heaven. He saved his soul. He redeemed himself. By saving John, he has saved himself, and he moves on to the heavenly pastures, so to speak. That's the way the album comes across to me. As far as its story goes. The music is magnificent. The band's playing of it is magnificent. Peter's singing on it, fantastic. The lyrics are pretty out there, but they sure are intriguing, that's for sure. I love the whole feel of the album. Tons and tons of great music here. I'm not going to name all the tracks on the album, but I'll just say, definitely the title song, Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, great rocker. In the Cage, another kick-ass Genesis prog rocker there. Counting Out Time, that was the closest the band had to a hit single on this album. A very funny moment where Rael is recalling his first sexual experience. Very funny tune there. Lily White Lilith is a great rocker. The Waiting Room is that's probably the most experimental track Genesis ever made, and it's still spooky. It's a spooky sucker, The Waiting Room. Colony of Slippermen, Riding the Scree in the Rapids, and of course the brilliant closer known as It, the exuberant rocker that closes the album, It. It's a total package. It's a very unique Genesis album in their catalog. And anyway, as we know, it's the final album with Peter Gabriel. I guess Peter just felt, hey, he didn't really have anywhere else to go musically with these guys after cranking out a mammoth album like this. So, as far as I'm concerned, Peter went out on a high note. It wouldn't be the end of the band, though, thank God. But, yes, The Lamb Lies Down Broadway. It's a controversial Genesis album, and it always will be, but it's certainly a most unique Genesis album. It is magnificent. Definitely a Genesis classic, and a great finale for Peter Gabriel, that's for sure. Hello, babe, with your guardian eyes so blue. The runner-up Genesis album, in my personal opinion, is Foxtrot from 1972. This is my personal favorite Genesis album from the Peter Gabriel era. I think it's arguably the best Genesis album with Peter Gabriel for the simple reason that it's got Supper's Ready on it. Need I say more? Supper's Ready is on this album. The all-time Genesis masterpiece, the 25-minute prog rock classic from Genesis. It's the most magnificent song that I think Genesis have ever done. It's their big grand epic, and it works beautifully. But not only Supper's Ready, I mean, you got other great Genesis prog rockers, classics like Watcher of the Skies, Can Utility, and the Coastliners, which doesn't get too much of a mention, but it really is a magnificent, thrilling prog rocker. Get 'Em Out by Friday is great. Timetable is a beautiful song. And of course, Horizons, that's Steve Hackett on a solo acoustic guitar with one of his most beautiful pieces that he ever recorded for the group. It's all good. It's magnificent, brilliant Genesis prog rock music. And if you want a great single slice of Genesis prog rock with Peter Gabriel at the microphone, I think Foxtrot is a wonderful place to start.
Like the dust that settles all around me.
And now we come to it at last, my number one favorite Genesis album of all time, Wind and Wuthering from 1976. And this is not only my favorite Genesis album, it's my favorite album, period, by anybody. Just looking at the album cover with that beautiful watercolor painting of the tree, and then when you flip the album cover over to the back and the tree becomes birds flying, it turns out that the leaves in the tree were all birds and they fly away. I mean, just looking at the cover is beautiful. It's probably the most beautiful album cover I've ever seen. But then you listen to the music. What can I say? I mean, I don't know how else I can describe it. It's the most beautiful album I've ever heard in my life. It is. It's a total package. The band's playing on it is phenomenal. Phil Collins' singing on it is outstanding. The songwriting is awesome. Tony Banks had a hand in writing most of the stuff here. But of course, Mike and Steve and Phil made contributions as well, of course. But my God, it's an album that just moves me so much. I mean, just starting with the opening rocker, 11th Earl of Mar. It's just an amazing piece. One for the Vine. I mean, that's an extended piece that Tony wrote that tells an adventurous story. Starts out very softly, but then it builds and builds and builds and builds, and then it gets calm again. It's a magnificent piece. It's a beautiful, glorious piece, too. Your Own Special Way. Mike Rutherford wrote that one. That was a small hit single for the band, and it kind of pointed the way of where the band was going to go in the future, but it's a beautiful song. Blood on the Rooftops. You know, if I had to pick my all-time favorite Genesis song of regular song length, Supper's Ready doesn't count because Supper's Ready is 25 minutes, even though I think that's the best piece Genesis ever recorded. But my favorite Genesis song that is of regular song length, I'd probably have to go with Blood on the Rooftops. Amazingly, it's a song about a guy watching television and commenting on the stuff that he sees on the TV. And it was co-written by Phil and Steve. But the way, the musical framework that the lyrics are put in for that song is just gorgeous. It's been described as the greatest song Tony Banks never wrote, Blood on the Rooftops, and I agree. It's just beautiful. The lyrics are a little strange, but, you know, Phil sings them with such emotion, and you put it together with the music, which is just gloriously beautiful, gloriously exquisite. I mean, Blood on the Rooftops, it goes against the grain, and yet it's a magnificent tune. And then, of course, the band finish off with that phenomenal instrumental, Unquiet Slumbers for the Sleepers, which then goes into In That Quiet Earth. It's a great instrumental workout for Genesis. And then, of course, the final song is the magnificently beautiful Afterglow, which the band has included in all of their recent tours since, even though the most recent tour was, well, 2007. But it became a permanent fixture in the band's live set, Afterglow. This album moves me so much. Wind and Wuthering, for me, it's the greatest album the band ever recorded. It touches me on so many different levels. I look at the album cover and I smile, I put it on, and it's the most breathtakingly beautiful platter of music I've ever heard in my life. You know, for me, it's the Genesis masterpiece. The band have many masterpieces in their catalog. They really do. The first masterpiece was Trespass, going back to 1970. But if I had to pick the masterpiece, I would go with Wind and Wuthering. It's their best album as far as I'm concerned. It's my favorite Genesis album, and it's my favorite album by anybody. Wind and Wuthering, #1 Genesis album of all time in my heart. And there you go. That's it. That's my take on the 15 studio albums by Genesis. As I've said, Genesis, they are my favorite band, whether it's Peter Gabriel singing lead or Phil Collins singing lead, or even that young Scottish fellow named Ray Wilson singing lead vocals. Their music has been a great friend to me since I was 12 years old. Even when the band were doing pop kind of stuff, that's fine. I love pop music. There's brilliant pop music out there, and Genesis made some brilliant pop music. And yet they never ever completely abandoned their prog roots. They made brilliant music from start to finish, even if the first album was a little touchy. But anyway, what can I say? Genesis, they are my favorite band. Peter, Phil, Mike, Tony, Steve, Anthony, John, Chris, the other John, Ray, Nick, Near. Thank you, Genesis.